Global business has really strongly recognised that if you get climate change wrong in terms of the impacts to business, if you don't fully understand the risks, then your business is at great risk in itself, indeed your profitability. I think back in 2006 there was some very important analysis undertaken actually by a leading financial services firm, where they came out and said that climate change should be top of the agenda for every board of directors of a company in the United States, and indeed further, because the risks are enormous. The risks of climate change impacts themselves, the risks of your customers leaving you because you're not engaged with the most pressing issue of our day, the risks that employees will take their talent elsewhere because they cease supporting the company values and see that the company's not as engaged as it should be. So there's a whole series of risks that business need to avoid. There's also a whole series of opportunities that business can take up in new product development and energy efficiency measures, in marketing in ways that don't use lots of resources and that are commensurate with the values of the community. So there's a risk and opportunity proposition, as there always has been for business, but in many ways the stakes are even higher with this issue. The first thing most of our companies do is start with their own impact, their own carbon footprint, and we're delighted to say that many of our companies have announced their intention to go carbon neutral. Some of them already are, some of them are well along the way. So that's a really important first step. Beyond that, there is a whole lot of important positioning work to do, policy work to do in relation to the international climate change negotiations. Certainly business has a view about that. There's increasing discussion about the value of sector by sector approaches. So for example, cement, oil, etc., and how you might measure emissions in each of those sectors and how you might ultimately seek to reduce emissions that way. There's also lots and lots of developments in terms of product and process innovation. There's lots of questions about technology transfer, how one company might transfer its technology to new companies in China or India, say. So the spectrum is enormous. It is one of the biggest issues of our time, and business is no exception in that equation. I think the corporate sector, particularly in key industry sectors, is very well aware of its climate change impact. Clearly major sectors such as oil and gas or the coal sector or chemicals are very, very well aware that they have been high carbon dioxide emitters. So there's been a lot of pressure on those sectors to engage, and indeed many of those companies are on the front foot in terms of looking into new developments of technology deployment. So we do see those companies engaging far more than they were in renewable energies research, which is very good news. We see them engage deeply in subjects such as carbon capture and storage. It's a controversial subject but has to be looked at in the context of the coal industry. So there's an immense amount of process innovation and business strategy indeed, and thinking going into what to do about these issues. Certainly business is well aware that their own customers, that consumers will punish them if they're not engaged deeply in these issues. And so I think business now has a very sophisticated grasp of these issues. I think the business would love to see a global carbon price. We have obviously a carbon price in Europe, but we don't have those kind of mechanisms for carbon trading and markets properly in place globally. Business works through the market, and the market side of climate change is not sufficiently developed. So there's lots to do, but I think there are some very, very expert people in climate change expertise in business now. Business understands the issues, but needs to make sure that governments respond more quickly. And I think in many respects, pushed by consumers, business is ahead of government in this game. I think business is engaging to a very great extent. One of the opportunities I have in my role is to listen and work with CEOs of our member companies. The World Business Council for Sustainable Development is a CEO-led organisation, and so listening to these leaders, these business leaders, speak about climate change, speak about the imperatives forcing them to act in their companies is very impressive. I think the leading sustainable development companies in the world have an incredibly deep strategic grasp of these issues. They understand the issues, they understand the need to innovate, they understand the risks presented to them. So I think that the leading companies in this space are very engaged. That said, there are quite a number of companies who I won't name, and certainly they're not our members, who are laggards, and that's particularly noticeable in the United States. So there's some companies who absolutely lead the pack, and there are others who really would just rather the issue would go away, and I'd be willing to bet money that that will be to their great detriment. I think the greatest challenges in climate leadership are staying abreast with the changes that climate change itself is presenting. We follow closely the findings of bodies like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and what is alarming about their findings and the findings of other experts is how swiftly the geological and other impacts of climate change are happening. So business does need to keep up with this and understand the level of urgency. I think there is a degree of frustration, particularly in global business, that the policy negotiations are not moving swiftly enough. I think it's a similar frustration to that just felt by ordinary consumers. So one of the big challenges is to try and get the laborious processes of government that relate to climate change to speed up, and I think business would wholeheartedly support that. I think the next steps are for business to be even more present and much more engaged in the global policy negotiations, the international government negotiations around climate change. I think that's happening. So I think we will see a very strong business presence at Poznan, which is the next conference of the parties to the Climate Change Convention, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. Business have a lot to say. They have a great deal to say about sector approaches, they have a great deal to say about innovation, they have a great deal to say about research and technology, and they have a great deal to say about markets. So it's important that business is listened to and is at the table, because what we don't want are a set of framework conditions for managing climate change that make no sense for business.